what if we have organized civil society, non-governmental organizations, assisting anti-corruption agencies in the effort to monitor infrastructure projects?
Corrupção é um problema internacional que afeta todas as sociedades e, recentemente, vários dos mais importantes países da comunidade internacional vêm enfrentando esse problema: China, Coreia do Sul e, naturalmente, o Brasil. Eu vou conversar agora com o professor Lagunes, da Universidade de Columbia, cuja pesquisa é especificamente voltada para compreender o que é corrupção, como pensam os corruptos e o que fazer para evitá-la. Professor Lagunes, thank you very much for being here with us. Let me start asking you why you chose it, the corruption as your main field of research. Was there any personal episode or great social event that brought your attention to it?
So I was born and raised in Mexico City, and I have been studying the issue of corruption for over 10 years now. When I began studying it professionally, systematically, as opposed to just living surrounded by it in Mexico, a developing country, I did so because there were personal reasons and there were professional reasons. The personal reasons were corruption was a daily part of the conversation. I tend to reference the case of my mother being extorted by a police officer driving the roads, and when somebody hurts your mother, you take that very personally.
Yep.
So that's one thing I can reference, but there are several instances that growing up in Mexico one sees. On the professional front, I had the opportunity at Yale University as a doctoral student to take a course with Susan Rose Ackerman, and she is one of the most established figures in corruption literature or research. And she has been studying this topic since the 1970s, and she's approached it not from a moralistic standpoint, but instead from an economic standpoint, where we try to understand the incentives at work. And that's a particularly fruitful approach because it allows you to see what you can change in terms of carrots and sticks to reduce corruption. So taking her class, I was introduced to the topic in a systematic, scholarly manner, and since then I've conducted various studies of my own, many of which have been co-authored.
And what are we talking about? I mean, is there any definition of what corruption is? It needs to involve money or other goods like power is valid too, or does it have to involve public office? What is corruption?
So it's important to recognize that this term is highly contested. It's equally contested to say another term like democracy. How do you know when you've reached democracy? Is it just when people have a vote, or is there more to it? Is it when a society is more equitable, or is there more to it? With regards to corruption, you can begin with questioning whether it's behavior that is strictly in the public or private sector. Maybe you don't even want to just restrict it. Maybe you say it's just general behavior, human behavior, and then you see what qualities of that behavior fall into corruption. I tend to focus on public sector corruption, and I tend to look at private sector corruption as fraud. Now, but the question still stands, so what is it? How do we know corruption when it hits you? The easiest, most efficient definition of the term is the abuse of public office for private gain. Again, that can be debated, because why are you restricting it to the public sector and not to the private sector? How do you define private gain? Is it always material? Is it that somebody pocketed money? But what about when that person, thanks to certain behavior that is questionable, rose in the ranks of politics or a bureaucracy? Isn't that also some form of gain? So it's highly contested. The term corruption comes from the term corrumpere, from the Latin, and it means to break apart. I like to think of the term corruption as linked to democratic thought and democratic values. So democracy or something is broken, a government is broken when it's unresponsive to the public interest.
Mm-hmm.
And when the officials who should be acting in the public's interest instead act in their own interest. So we can think of it very precisely as corruption is the abuse of public gain, of public office for private gain, or we can see it a little more broadly and see it as an unresponsive government. So, but I want to recognize it's contested.
You have a very broad view of this issue, corruption, from psychological aspects of it, like what a police officer, a corrupt police officer thinks when he's acting in that way, to the effects of the economic development of a society, of corruption. How corruption works in practice?
Well, so there are, again, there are two forms of corruption. You have venal corruption, you have instrumental corruption. Venal corruption, again, would be when they want to just pocket. Instrumental corruption is where there's a quid pro quo and the exchange involves some professional gains. Now, how it works, they will vary. So the thing about studying corruption, and the reason I don't think I'll ever get tired of it, is because it's always innovating, and it touches so many aspects of a government or of society that studying it also requires understanding those different realms of government and society. So it will vary greatly. I've studied corruption in the police, in Mexico City's police, for example. This was some time ago, so some things have changed. But when I conducted that research with two of my co-authors, Athindar Venkataramani and Brian Freed, what we noticed was the opportunity for corruption tended to happen when the citizen did something wrong, violated some law. And then the question is, does that official, police officer, decide to enforce the law in an appropriate manner, or do they take that opportunity to make a private gain as a result of it? But it begins with the citizen actually breaking the law, violating the law. In this case, it was minor traffic violations, but still, it was a violation of traffic laws. And then police officers then decided, and we left it up to police officers to decide whether they were going to issue a ticket, let the driver off with a warning, or request for a bribe. And not a single traffic ticket was issued. So the law was never enforced appropriately. And instead, the law was enforced informally through the collection of, or the request of bribes. So that's one example, and we know then from interviews and from additional research, including research done by others, that these police officers tended to have, in those days, were paid very little, and so they had to compensate their low salaries with other sources of finance. And so that's policing, but then you could look at issues like property taxation, how does it work there, and depending on the interest we can discuss. We can look at corruption, public financing of elections or financing of elections. We can look at corruption in public infrastructure. I mean, it'll vary depending on the sector, on the activity.
Professor, is there any fundamental difference between corrupt people or corruption in general? You made field research in New York City and Mexico City, but in other places too, Europe, Africa, here in Brazil. Is there any fundamental difference between corrupt people and how they act in different places in Earth?
So this is where I again would reference my advisor's work, Susan Rose Ackerman. And the reason I would do so is because, again, we want to distinguish moral issues and normative issues from incentives. Because I don't think it's fair to say or correct to say that some people are less moral than others. I don't think that's really what's going on here. I don't think there's something in a person's DNA that makes him more or less corrupt. I don't think that's a fruitful way to think about it. I think we want to think about how that society is structured. What are the incentives in place that makes it less or more likely somebody will be corrupt? So this is what I mean. In certain societies, so let's say you're in a Scandinavian country, or you're in, say, Brazil or Mexico. You're the same person, But when I'm in one society versus in the other, I understand that the rules of the game in that society are different. And so I will behave differently. So I know that in Mexico, to win a government contract, if I'm perfectly honest and pure, it may be less easy for me to win that contract. Whereas again, in a Scandinavian country, I know that if I attempt to bribe, that will be actually at a disadvantage because I will stand out as one of the few competing businesses trying to get that contract through corrupt means. So it depends on how that society is structured. And that same person may act differently under those different incentive structures.
So you have to take account of the context.
Yes.
It's not a case of different people acting like themselves. They act like the context permits them.
And so when people, it's very common to have somebody blame the culture. So blaming corruption on the culture. And we have to be, again, very careful because how can such a beautiful, fascinating, rich culture like Brazil's culture provide samba, provide this wonderful cuisine, provide, again, such a rich culture? How could that rich and interesting and beautiful culture also provide corruption? Obviously, it's not just culture. There's something else going on. So what I'm trying to say is I am separating I'm de-emphasizing a cultural argument, and instead of saying, let's look at the incentive structures.
And how are the impacts of corruption in a society? You once said corruption holds society back. I'm not talking, and you were not talking, I think, of the obvious act of stealing. It's the regressive impact of corruption in a society. What do you mean by this, by that corruption holds society back?
So corruption will have objectively negative impact on a society. So it's not, again, not just a normative thing, whether we like or don't like corruption. I oppose corruption, and several of us oppose corruption for objective, practical reasons. We know from survey data that corruption reduces the perception of legitimacy of a government. So a government that's revealed to be corrupt loses the trust of the people, and therefore makes it harder for that government to lead that people. We know that corrupt governments also tend to have larger budget deficits. We know that corruption makes it hard, so corrupt agreements are hard to enforce and therefore make an economy that relies on these sorts of agreements less efficient. The list can go on, but let me take it more to the specifics. So a policeman or policewoman is the face of government, the daily face of government for the public. They give the public an impression of what government is like. So if that police officer, instead of being a reputable person that can be looked highly at, that can be respected, instead participates in corruption, instead of enforcing the law, participates in corruption, that also influences society and it sets the rules of the game. This is how government expects society to relate to it, by breaking the law instead of enforcing the law. So again, it has impacts on governance. Corruption has a negative impact on governance, has a negative impact on the economy, has negative impact on things that need to be regulated, like the environment, like protection of cultural sites, like the proper building of buildings. Mm-hmm. And it also has an impact when an official, from policeman to a president, is corrupt. It's telling society this is how the rules of the game are played, and so it does promote even more corruption.
Yeah, in one of your articles, you wrote that corruption affects more the poor than the rich, at least in unequal societies. How does it work?
So corruption and power are interrelated, and the way we studied it, again, this is my colleagues, Athene Darvin Kantaramani and Brian Fried and I, what we asked was, well, how does corruption and inequality interact? How do these two factors interact? And you can think of it going several ways. So a wealthy individual will have a thicker wallet, can pay off more officials, and at the same time may be more attractive as an object of extortion. So maybe a wealthy individual is also somebody that corrupt officials want to target more actively because of the promise of high rewards. The challenge is that the poor are vulnerable. Again, power, in terms of power, they're vulnerable. They don't have connections in government, so that if they're extorted, they don't have any means of recourse. They don't have anyone they can call up and complain about what just happened to them. And so it ends up happening that, at least in extortive scenarios, the more vulnerable, the poor, tend to be the object of more corrupt requests than the rich. And instead, the rich get what they want as the privilege of being rich and looking rich. So that was in the context of policing. But you can imagine how it might play out in other realms, like, again, contracting. If I have contacts, if I'm well off and I went to the same school as the politician who or the mayor of the city or that city, and I can call up that mayor and say, I want this contract. Well, I never had to pay a single bribe, but I was able to influence public action and gained that contract just by a phone call. So there was no financial exchange necessarily, but there was undue influence because that contract was given to me as a result of my contacts and not as a result of my meriting necessarily that contract.
As far as I know, you were studying during the last years corruption in infrastructure projects. I think that's in Peru, isn't it? I cannot stress enough how this is relevant for Brazilian situation, political crisis right now. Corruption in infrastructure projects are at the core of the present Brazilian political crisis. Is there anything specific in this kind of corruption in infrastructure projects, and what is necessary specifically to deal with it?
So the problem with corruption infrastructure is that it's one of those things that does hold a society back, because infrastructure is essential. It's essential to an economy. Good roads, solid schools, solid hospitals. It connects a society, gives a society a place to extend its activities, and so we know it's essential. It's central to an economy. When corruption affects the execution of infrastructure projects, we tend to see two things. We tend to see cost overruns and time overruns. I guess there's a third, and that's lower quality in what's produced. So cost overruns means that the project was budgeted at a certain amount and they go beyond that. Yeah. And so then if it's being financed with public funds, then that is a cost to the Treasury. That's money that could have gone to, say, public services. It's money that could have gone to build other infrastructure projects. So when corruption leads to diversion of money from that project, or to more money being spent on that project than should have, there's definitely a social cost. Time overruns is the other one, highly correlated with the first one that I mentioned. And that is a project that was supposed to be complete at a certain moment went beyond that. Sometimes because the contractors, the developers, use time as a negotiating tactic. So we will not, they freeze the execution of that project until they're paid more for the completion of the project. And then the third one is a project that should be built at this level of quality is actually built at this level of quality. And that difference, those raw products that should have been purchased that were of a higher quality, or that money is instead pocketed or diverted. So corruption infrastructure is a major problem for any society. In the case of Peru, which is the country I am studying at the moment, the question there is, what do we do about it? How do we go about reducing corruption in public infrastructure? One of the mechanisms that's typically thought to work is enhanced monitoring. So increased audits or increased monitoring of the infrastructure for the sake of making sure they're doing what they're supposed to do. The challenge is authorities, even anti-corruption authorities that are sincere about wanting to fight corruption, cannot monitor everything. So if they're sincere about fighting corruption, they should seek the help, the assistance of those who benefit most directly by that infrastructure, society,
Okay.
citizens. The challenge is that citizens
The
don't
involvement of civil society.
Correct.
Oh, yeah.
The challenge is that citizens, the regular citizen does not necessarily know how to audit or how to monitor a construction project, an infrastructure project, because they don't have the time to spend on that. They have busy lives, and they don't necessarily have the know-how to differentiate whether it's good or bad concrete, whether it has proper reinforcement or not. So what I'm doing in that study is I'm asking, what if we have organized civil society, non-governmental organizations, assisting anti-corruption agencies in the effort to monitor infrastructure projects? So that sounds promising, but there is a limitation that I recognize in the study, and that's that these NGOs, these civil society organizations, they don't have sanctioning capacity. So if they uncover wrongdoing, they then are not able to punish except through shaming. So that's why in that study, what I'm trying to argue is that there's plenty of room for collaboration between authorities that are sincere about fighting corruption and civil society organizations that can help by doing some of the monitoring.
Okay, you mentioned shaming, and you once said transparency, public scrutiny, and shaming are not enough. You got to punish corruption, and you phrase as you got to fry the big fish. Do you believe that Brazil now and finally entered this phase of frying big fishes?
I want to congratulate Brazil and what Brazilians are accomplishing. They are frying big fish. It's impressive. And I think they should be the envy of other Latin American countries. The only other instance I've seen do this is the Clean Hands movement in Italy. So no, I do want to be clear. I want to congratulate Brazil in being so active in fighting corruption and prosecuting the corrupt. That being said, you cannot just focus on prosecuting. You also need to pass the sort of institutional reforms that will inhibit corruption in the future. So you want to get at the incentives. What were the core incentives that led to the corruption? You also want to get at those. But the nice thing, the promising thing of prosecuting corruption is that you break with impunity, you let the corrupt know that they're not protected and that the rules of the game have changed. That if they do this again, if they act in this way again, they will be punished. So that's very important. And again, congratulations to Brazil.
Yeah, you mentioned the rules of the game. And you mentioned the Manipulite, the Clean Hands operation there in Italy. In Italy, there was a reaction by the politicians. They changed some laws. They constrained the action of the judges and prosecutors. And several people say that the reaction to Clean Hands operation invented Silvio Berlusconi after the Clean Hands operation of the 1990s. Is this a risk to the change of the rules become the response of this corrupt way of thinking of some niches inside political system?
The first thing, I guess I'm catching three things in your three points in your question. So the first is whether the risk of limiting the powers of the prosecutors.
Yes.
There's a risk of that. Then there's a risk of if prosecutors are thoroughly successful in cleaning up an entire political class, that leaves a vacuum that can be leveraged by a populist.
Yeah, there in Italy, all the main parties ceased to exist
Right.
after the Clean Hands operation.
Right. So it's I can't foresee Brazil's future, so I'll be very careful in saying what may happen. I do think, to the extent that we recognize that corruption is a problem, it's not a necessary evil. It's an evil, period, right?
Yeah.
So it's not something that just is used to grease the wheels. No, it's actually sand in the wheels of a society and of an economy. We need to think differently about it. So to the extent that we accept that corruption is just, should not be tolerated and should be minimized, then we want prosecutors to do their job and keep going as they have. We don't want to limit them because they're doing the public's, they're promoting the public interest by doing what they do. If that results in wiping out the political class, that is not the prosecutor's fault. Ultimately, that is the fault of those who decided to act in a corrupt manner. So I don't think it's a question of asking prosecutors to moderate or to reduce the objectives that's why they're there for. That's why the public wants them there. So then what happens if we have a political vacuum? Well, we do have to recognize that risk. We do look at Italy and see the rise of Berlusconi, and many of us would see that as an unfortunate conclusion to that. What is the solution? I can't say for sure. I do think there are, from what I've been hearing, there are some political leaders in Brazil that are worth looking to and that are interesting and that have the promise quite a bit for Brazilian society, that they're not populist and they're not going to, they're not charismatic leaders with empty promises, is what I'm trying to say. So then the question is, how do you get those politicians to represent the next generation of Brazil's political class? How do we encourage that? That's I think maybe what the media can maybe help establish, is putting the spotlight on these clean, forward-thinking, innovative politicians. Which, by the way, Berlusconi, one of the ways he leveraged that power vacuum is precisely because of his position in the media.
Democracies are more prone to corruption than autocratic societies. Or was there any relation between certain regimes and corruption? Is there any relation?
Right, so there's statistical evidence that autocratic governments tend to be more corrupt than democratic governments. Autocratic governments also tend to have poorer societies than democratic ones. Democracy is not perfect. And for many societies, their democracies are a work in progress. Mexico's democracy is work in progress. I think it's a step in the right direction in fighting corruption, because the citizenry is damaged by corruption, by an unresponsive government. And democracy is one of those things that helps link society and government. Democracy is a way for citizens to inform government of what they like and dislike by voting people in or voting people out. So that's one reason why democracy is a part antidote to corruption. That being said, we have cases, success stories of non-democratic governments reducing corruption. Singapore being a prime example of this. Small society, highly homogeneous society that was very corrupt during the colony, but then today is one of the cleanest, has one of the cleanest bureaucracies. So what I would say is democracies should look at a case like Singapore for things that are worth adopting, like higher paid officials, government officials, so that they don't have to compensate their salaries with alternative forms of payment like bribes, and a successful anti-corruption agency that prosecutes the corrupt. It's the combination of well-paid officials that value their job, that are faced with the risk of losing that job if they participate in corruption, but maintain democracy, which is a highly successful, a very effective way for citizens to inform government of whether they approve or disapprove of what's being done.
Professor, in general terms, what is the most efficient way to fight corruption, or at least to contain its effects?
I would start by saying corruption should not be society's only priority. And you can't just put all your eggs in that basket. There will be a point at which there are diminishing returns. So every dollar spent on more anti-corruption maybe could be better spent at some point later on other things like education or other social goods. So corruption is not the only priority, or fighting corruption should not be society's only priority. However, we have established, I think, that it's an important priority. And in terms of successfully fighting it, you have to do, first you do have to fight, you do have to fry the big fish. You do have to figure out what the leading problems are. And you do have to show that the rules of the game have changed. So there cannot be untouchables. So you need to figure out which politicians or which bureaucrats represent corruption for society and for those around it. And you have to start with them. You also, again, want to go at where there's more contact between the public and officials. Again, policing, teachers, if there's corruption in that sector, hospitals. You need to also attack at the level where there's a lot of interaction between citizens and government, as a way, again, to say the rules of the game have changed. Increased transparency. I know Brazil has a quite successful freedom of information law. I hope that is maintained. I hope it's maybe even enhanced. So the more transparency, the more transparent government you have, the less discretion officials have, and the less able they are to abuse that discretion. So it's not to eliminate discretion, it's to ensure that the discretion that they have can then be reviewed to make sure it was used for the public interest. Or in some cases, yes, reduce the discretion so that there's less room to maneuver and do foul play.
Professor Paul Lagunes, I want to thank you very much for the
Thank
conversation.
You, Renato.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be in Brazil. Thank you.